Good afternoon. This is Deborah V. Wilson in Haifa, Israel. The time is 1300 hours and 37 minutes, and it is GMT plus 2. GMT plus 2. The name of this podcast today is I Don't Know, I Didn't Know Him. Years ago, when I'm from Chicago. The bulk of my business career has been in Chicago. I had the good fortune of being professionally employed thanks to the sound education my parents were able to afford for me. And so, as what happened, I'm 59 years old, just to give you to contextualize the period of time I'm talking about in Chicago. And Chicago has a history of racial discrimination, and accompanying that is segregation and lack of education for disproportionately for people of color, African Americans, Latinx persons. In any case, because my parents were able to afford private education for me, I was more likely to be professionally employed. And as what happened, because it was Chicago and the particular cultural and racial dynamics, I often was one of a few, if not the only African American in a company. So I remember often, you read the newspaper. In my family, you read the newspaper, you watched the news. There was no social media. We got several newspapers. I was used to reading the Chicago Tribune, the Chicago Sun-Times, and the Chicago Defender. The Chicago Defender's main readership, the bulk of its readership, would be African Americans. But my parents, who were very pragmatic about the racial discourse in Chicago, always felt like we had to read the other papers. That was the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. So I remember always reading the papers and watching the news, because if a black person committed a crime, I always had to be ready with an answer. There came a time when I was at a company. There were very few black people on the professional side of this company. And I remembered a black man committed a particularly heinous crime. And I let you remember my coworkers, we were calling each other, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with this? And one woman decided this was a good day to call in and tell her boss she was going to work from home. We all came up with strategies. Mine was avoidance. I remembered being literally in the company kitchen by the water cooler. Literally, one of my white colleagues came up to me and said, "Did you read about black man killing people?" And she drew in a breath as if to start with the questions. And I remember saying abruptly, "I don't know. I didn't know him." And I walked out of the kitchen. And I told one of my African American colleagues what I had done. And I remember he said, "Yeah, I just did something similar myself." I'm also, in addition to being African American from Chicago, I am Muslim from America. The same onus of explaining your people that was projected, and still is, to the African American community, is now a burden that's being put on many Muslim communities. I'm going to cross the pond because the Muslim community I actually know the most about, that I've spent the most time in, would be in Britain. I actually define myself, if I had to attach a nationality to my faith, it would be that I'm a British Muslim. I've done most of my worshiping in Britain. Most of the Muslims I know are in Britain. Most of the people I've worshipped with, if you're going to actually quantify it, would be in Britain. So I remember, and it's been a while since I've actually been in Britain. I flew through Britain on the 7th of March, but actually, the 6th of March, but actually to be in Britain, it's been a while. But the last time I was in Britain, I remember Muslims some Muslims with a great deal of exhaustion, some with anger, most with exhaustion, that every time something happened globally, the UK is much more global than, say, the USA, its citizens, which is a good thing. In this regards, not so sure. And I know myself, as well as other Muslims, the constant query of, what do you think about what happened there? Can you believe another terrorist attack? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? I know how I felt, and I know how the African American community felt many years ago when, did you hear about in the paper that guy that, I don't know, I didn't know him. I remember it well. So, as I said, probably the way I identify myself as a British Muslim. So I follow the news, I follow security issues, and I'm well aware that some British Muslims feel they've been securitized, their identities. And they're put in a constant position of explaining, what do you think? What's your position? Confirm to me you're not one of them. It's been no secret among the tiny circle of people I know in the UK that I'm not a particular fan of some aspects of PREVENT, which is part of the overall contest security model for, among other things, addressing extremism of all stripes. Is particular, some of the particular manifestations of PREVENT that I find problematic would be the disruption of societal spaces and places. I think we all should be aware and have the resilience, and it does take resilience to be aware when someone has gone afoul, afoot, astray of what is normal behavior. Criminality would not be normal behavior. And in criminality, whether it's politically based or not, we should all be aware, and we should all be willing to come forward. The state must provide places and spaces for us to safely come forward, but we should all. But the structuring of a system that asks your fellow citizens, sister citizens, to keep an eye on you, at least you might go astray. I don't know what the security benefits are. It's not likely, and again, the context here is the UK, it's not likely MI5 and Special Branch are going to have me sitting in a meeting with them. One would hope, but it's not likely. So I continue to wonder and query what is the damage to society? What's the balance? The damage, the benefit to security? I don't know. When you go to a dentist, when you go to when you send your children to school, when you go to school, when you go to the grocer, when you go to your service providers, that's the previously agreed upon relationship. You're my dentist, you're my doctor, you're my professor. Now again, we should all, and no matter what space, regardless of the space we occupy in society, know that our role as a responsible person is that if someone goes astray, we should speak up, and the state should provide spaces and places and avenues for us to do that safely. But I wonder what happens when roles are eroded. When going to the dentist and you have a particular identity and everybody knows you have a particular identity because of your name or because you're a woman and you cover. What does that do to your relationship with your dentist? What does that do with your relationship with your professor? What does that do if you just want to criticize? You're in a class, you're in a political science class, and you want to criticize something your government is doing. That's your right as a citizen. That's your right as a person. But what happens when you're afraid that my professor or my dentist, what happens if I vent about how much British people drink? They do drink a lot. I've always thought British people drank a lot. But when I say that, Americans say that, white Americans or Christian say it. We all, when you go to the UK, and if you're walking down the street on a Saturday night, good Lord, you hear the Americans go, good Lord, these people all drink like they're 18 years old and first year college students in colleges, university for us in the U.S. But what happens when you say that and you're Muslim and your identity is Muslim? So what does that mean? What happens if you have a particular belief system that isn't... London is really laid back and really embracing, and I would say it's not particularly conservative overall. It's why I love the city. I'm not the most particular orthodox person in my religiosity. I love the fact that it's liberal. Not all people do, and it's uncomfortable for them. But what happens when you know you can't say, these kids need to cover up, these young women need to cover up, because that your identity is that you're Muslim, but that's what you think. And it doesn't sound very different than the average African-American woman I might meet in Chicago who's 60 plus years old. If a young woman has a skirt on that's quote-unquote too short. But as long as she's Christian, it's okay. So I don't know, and it's not likely I'm going to be sitting on a MI5 special branch meeting about what exactly and how successful PREVENT is, and what it has done to, in effect, what has happened to a people, a group, a cluster, who is actually very different. I can tell you, as a person who identifies as a British Muslim, we are not that much alike. We really aren't. We have all sorts of cultural differences, individual ideologies and belief systems about how our path is to the Creator. But what happens when you lump a group together because they share one identity, Muslim? What happens when you lump them together and then their identity is securitized, and then what you do is you double down on securitizing them and securitizing everything, well, many aspects of their lives around them. Is it productive? I don't know. And then what happens when you do that? You have that model that's part of the national security model. So what happens when you have that model and then you also give voice to the fact repeatedly that you think certain groups within the Muslim community have turned in on themselves? They're inward looking, not outward looking. And then what happens when you have all these parameters of what is, look out, join the community, be more modern, quote unquote, be less orthodox, my word. But then you seek your counsel in constructing your models from the most orthodox men of the British Muslim communities. What's that about? So those are questions that I have, and I don't know. But if ever there is another consultation that deals with British national security, specifically the PREVENT program, specifically how this modality of PREVENT, when it comes to Muslims, I know PREVENT has been it's been stated again and again that it's all forms of extremism, but particularly how it impacts the British Muslim communities. If there ever the next consultation that's open to the public, I'd love to attend, because I'm really curious to know what this particular modality of national security in Britain, in the United Kingdom, has done for the collective safety of all. This is Debra V. Wilson. I'm in Haifa, Israel, and I'm pretty resolute that it's GMT +2. And the date is the 15th of April, 2017, and it's Saturday. Thank you.